Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rick Hassan of UC Irvine School of Law and of our new Fair Elections and Free Speech Center that I co-direct with my colleague David Kay. Established in 2021 after the contentious 2020 US presidential election, the Fair Elections and Free Speech Center, UCI, is unique among US and global institutions in that it's dedicated solely to advancing an understanding of and offering the means to counter threats to the stability and legitimacy of democratic governments, exacerbated by the unregulated growth of digital media and other changes in mass communications. We had an event last week on election subversion. I'll be putting a link to the video and transcript of that event in the chat. We're here today to begin a three-part series on disinformation in American elections. The first part of the series today features a discussion with election officials. The second event, which will take place at the end of the month, will be with law professors and thinking about legal issues related to disinformation in US elections. And the final event in early November, and I'll put the link in for that event, will feature social scientists. And that one will be moderated by former NPR voting correspondent Pam Fessler. Today, we are very fortunate to be joined by the Secretary of State of Michigan, Jocelyn Benson, by the Orange County, California Registrar, Neal, Kelley, and by Tammy Patrick of the Democracy Fund. And she will be moderating the event. I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists and then turn it over to Tammy for the duration of the program. If you have questions, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will see if we can find time to get through at least some of your questions. It's a very packed day. Secretary Benson, we understand, is on her way in, so she may be starting with us a few minutes late, and she's going to have to leave at the top of the hour. So we will get through as much as we can with her, and we may stay on a little bit longer just with Tammy Patrick and Registrar Kelley. So let me introduce the three panelists by briefly reading part of their bios. You can find their entire biographies listed on the Fair Elections and Free Speech Center website, law.uci.edu/FEFS. Jocelyn Benson is Michigan's 43rd Secretary of State. In this role, she's focused on ensuring that elections are secure and accessible, and dramatically improving customer experiences for all who interact with their offices. Benson is the author of Secretaries of State, Guardians of the Democratic Process, the first major book on the Secretaries of State in enforcing election and campaign finance laws. A graduate of Harvard Law School and expert on civil rights law, Benson served as Dean of the Wayne State University Law School in Detroit. When she was appointed as Dean at age 36, she became the youngest woman in US history to lead a top 100 accredited law school. Neal Kelley is the Registrar of Voters of Orange County, California, the fifth largest voting jurisdiction in the United States, serving more than 1.8 million registered voters. Kelley has served as a registrar since 2005 and has led the office through the largest cycle of elections since Orange County was founded in 1889. Prior to joining Orange County, Kelley developed and grew several companies of his own, employing hundreds of people from 1999 to 2004. He's been a recipient of numerous state and national awards for election administration. He's a former appointee and founding member of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Election Security Task Force, where he helped to oversee the protection of the nation's election infrastructure. Tammy Patrick is senior advisor to the elections program at Democracy Fund, an independent foundation working to ensure that our political system is able to withstand challenges and deliver on its promise to the American people. In 2013, she was selected by President Obama to serve as a commissioner on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, which led to a position at the Bipartisan Policy Center to further work on the commission. Prior to that, she was the federal compliance officer for the Maricopa County Elections Department in Arizona, where for 11 years she established herself as a collaborative partner for those seeking to improve the American election experience. I'm so glad that the three of you, or two of you for now, and the third coming, are with us here today to talk about this urgent topic, disinformation in American elections. Tammy, I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks so much, Rick. It's wonderful to be here. I'm so excited to have this conversation with my longtime colleague and friend, Neal Kelley, Registrar Kelley, and as well as Secretary Benson when she's able to join us. I wanted to share real quickly before we kick off, or as we kick off rather, the conversation, information about mis and disinformation. When we think about mis and disinformation, I think we should think about it in a couple of ways. First is, what are the sources of the mis and disinformation that's circulating around our elections and the elections ecosystem? So we have partisan actors, we have criminals, we have foreign adversaries that are playing a key role in this ecosystem and the way in which information is being disseminated. And they all have different types of motivations. Those motivations can be to sow general chaos. It can be to influence the election. It can also be, in fact, to steal identity and to use the election season as a way of advancing criminal behaviors and criminal activities. So I wanted to share this graphic that came out. I saw it was shared by the West Virginia Secretary of State's office in the last couple of days, and it was put together by fightcybercrime.org and the National Association of Secretaries of State, because it speaks to this question of mis and disinformation as part of election season scams. So donation scams, fake surveys and polls, voter registration scams, and a lot of this ties around with identity theft and other things. But I thought this was a good kind of starting point. When we think about mis and disinformation, we can't keep ourselves limited just to information about where your polling place is or who can vote in any given election. And I want to also, in the course of the next 45 minutes or so, really dive into what are the protections that people can use in order to protect themselves from this situation. So the first thing I want to say about that is look for the official election mail logo. There, I've said it, now I've gotten it out of the way, as a key indicator when you're getting mail in from that's about elections from your election official. It gives you an indication as to what exactly is official and what you might want to question the legitimacy of. So with that, Registrar Kelley, Neal, before we go too far, I want to just check in with you and your office, because we haven't talked for a couple of months, and there's been a lot going on. You've had a recall election. It seems like 2020 is the year that will never end. So I'd love to check in with you and just hear about how you're doing, and also how your staff is holding up in this moment.
Well, thank you, Tammy. And big thank you to Rick and UC School of Law. This is fantastic, the event that you're hosting, so I appreciate it. I would lie to you, Tammy, if I said this wasn't challenging. Members of my team and this great staff that I have came here to do good work, and they've all made sacrifices along the way. I think any election official would tell you that. And that's despite obstacles. We continue to do the work of protecting ballots and counting votes. And I was struck recently by an article I read in CNN that was quoting a doctor who was lamenting on the disinformation around COVID and vaccines, et cetera. And he was just saying, I don't know if I can do this anymore. It's been really frustrating. I've never encountered this kind of attacks on science, et cetera. And I'm thinking, that's kind of daily in elections for us now, So I guess the answer to the question is we're holding up pretty well. It's been a rough couple of years, but this is what we do, and we're resilient. We're going to keep marching forward.
And that's a great, well, it's not a great parallel, but it's exactly where we find ourselves in a situation where the truth and facts are really having a hard time gaining any traction in the hearts and minds of voters across the country. And that can be a real challenge in how do we get the right information in people's hands and convince them that it is in fact the truth. So let's just dig into that a little bit more. What do you feel has been the biggest challenge in this moment? I mean, and let's be really clear. If you want to give a little bit of a background on the size of your jurisdiction, I mean, I think it's pretty well known that your jurisdiction has some of the best practices in the country. You are always on the cutting edge in the forefront of how to service your voters effectively, efficiently, and equitably. So in an office like that is fairly well resourced, I don't think there's an election office in the country that's as well resourced as they should be. If you're still encountering these situations, what hope does anyone else have, as it were?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was going to ask you, how much time do we have again? We are, as Rick said at the top, we're a large jurisdiction, 1.8 million registered voters. We have more voters here in Orange County than 23 states in the country. And so we're not small in that regard, but I think we face obviously the same challenges that any jurisdiction does, as you point out. And, what's the biggest challenge? I mean, for me, going into 22 and 24, it's the manipulation of fearful people and the culture wars ignoring basic facts. I mean, this is what we're up against, as election officials. And I hope you would let me opine for a second.
Absolutely.
This continual volley between groups proclaiming there's no widespread fraud in elections, which I'm one of those because, we work on the front lines, versus those who believe that all elections are ripe with fraud, I feel is getting us nowhere. I feel like we're on a treadmill, not making much progress. And if you add to that a small subset of vocal individuals across the country who have these extremist election fraud views and are afforded outsized respect, in my opinion, in many cases, that's kind of a recipe for disaster. And I think as a result, upcoming elections are not very appealing to those of us that run them. And in fact, this has mutated into a real migraine for election officials. 2020, as you pointed out, is just never ending. And I want to add just a kind of a quick anecdote to this, a parallel. I'm a history buff, and I was struck by these parallels between the early start of electricity in this country versus what we're facing today. And back in the 18th and 19th century, a lot of people thought that electricity involved black magic or witchcraft, and they bought into this, and they really believed that. And when they started to industrialize electricity, you had people like Edison and Westinghouse and Tesla started to spread misinformation and disinformation about each other's technology to benefit, what they were trying to sell. And this is exactly what we're seeing in some cases in elections. We had a recall election, as you pointed out, and days before we even counted the ballots, we had a candidate making outrageous claims about a rigged election before we even released any results. Sound familiar? So I think we're going to start seeing some of those things continue to come back again and again. And the biggest challenge is going to be just what we're talking about today, is misinformation. And
Absolutely.
sorry for going on too much.
No, you can opine. That's what this is for. We're going to welcome Secretary Benson has joined us. Welcome. It's great to see you. We kind of kicked off talking a little bit about some of the sources of mis and disinformation and motivations people have for spreading them. And I really wanted to check in with both of you. We haven't spoken for a couple of months, I don't think, and just check in on you and your staff and how you're holding up in this moment, because you and your staff, particular in Michigan, have had a lot of attention and a lot of misinformation and a lot of disinformation and a lot of physical threats and issues that are stemming from this continued fervor around. I mentioned earlier that 2020 just doesn't seem to ever end. So I'd love to check in with you before we dive into the questions too hard or too far.
Well, thank you. And thanks for having me here. It's great to be in a moment where we can have a sort of deeper conversation and great to see my colleague, Neal, and obviously Tammy, you've been such a great friend for so long, as has Rick. So it's just great to be here with all of you, and thanks for having this really important conversation. I think the best way to succinctly say how we're doing right now is weary, incredibly weary, almost exhausted, but we know that that's what, at least in the political arena, those who are advancing anti-democracy agendas want. They want to wear us down. They want to intimidate us out of the process. And so at the same time, while we acknowledge that impact that it's feeling, that we immediately pivot into all of us recognizing that we just got to keep pushing, and if nothing else, double down on our determination to keep moving forward. I think I'm long past the point of thinking that 2020 was a temporary moment. I remember in November and December waking up at the beginning of every week or even every day thinking, surely this is the last stand. Surely once we certify Wayne County, we can move on. Surely once we certify the state election, we'll be able to move on. Surely once we manage and count all the electoral college votes and send them to Washington, our work will be done and we can move on. Because I wanted to get to a point where we could sit back and say, wow, more people voted than ever before in 2020 in a very secure election, the most secure in our lifetime. So how do we make sure that's more than a moment? How do we build off of that? That's the conversation I wanted to have, January 7th. But of course, the conversation we had January 7th and every day since is very different. And I think that's a tragedy in itself, that we're not talking about how to replicate the success of 2020, but instead continuing to fight the misinformation. But of course, it's all now focused on, in my view, the next round. That 2020 was just a warm up, and I'm deeply concerned as someone who is very optimistic and was optimistic throughout 2020. I'm deeply concerned about the uncertainties going into 2024, many of those of which are being played out now. And that's where the weariness comes in. I'm tired of not talking about the truth. I'm tired of not talking about the success of 2020. I'm tired of having to continue to say, okay, that's a lie, this is the truth, and now da. Like, and I'm losing sight of that end of the tunnel, because the tunnel now is so long that it's going to take us probably through 2025 at least. And that means we just have to gear up, that the marathon we ran in 2020 did not end in 2020. It's instead been extended into an ultra marathon that's going to last another 4 years. And we just have to accept that, gear up, and keep running the race, because democracy truly depends on it.
I think that's exactly spot on. And it's interesting because so many people have said, oh, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And it's a sprinting marathon, right? Because you're expected to go full blown, full on. And then you're right, you get to the end and it's not the 26 miles, it's 50 miles or more. And that is absolutely the case, that we haven't had the ability to sit back and say, you know what, not only was this the most secure election, it was the most audited election we've ever seen in this country, with people voting on more paper ballots than we've had since we only had paper ballots decades ago. We had more litigation. All of these things should have been validators of the election itself. And instead, we find ourselves continually having to redress this narrative of false information where facts really don't matter at all. And so one of the things that the first question I had asked Registrar Kelley was, what are you seeing in your office as the biggest challenge? And that's where we kind of got into this notion of, facts are not mattering in this moment. I loved the Westinghouse and Edison and Tesla conversation, because it is a moment where normally you tell people the truth, but there are so many validators in the field that are not speaking the truth, and they are perpetuating this misinformation in a way that is truly, I think, problematic for our democracy.
Yeah, was that for me?
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, and that's what, and the reason they're doing it is because it's become financially lucrative to do it, and they're getting fame and celebrity off of it on the various news channels that are taking that misinformation and amplifying it. And so it's sort of the motivation is kind of self-serving. It's serving a partisan agenda. It's also geared towards trying to create chaos and confusion around our elections, which is also what we fought against in 2020. We wanted to provide clarity, that even in a time when there's so much confusion about the pandemic, people could have faith in their democracy. And I think that's really what we need to get back to, and on our messaging, for lack of a better word, meaning what we're starting to see on both sides of the quote unquote aisle is people losing faith in democracy, people feeling on one side that they're believing the lies and the misinformation, on the other side they're believing or seeing the attacks on democracy, and kind of becoming, as we all are feeling, like democracy is under attack. And I read there was some it's some massive number, like 97% of people feel democracy is under attack, or 93% of people in a poll feel that democracy is under attack for different reasons. And that, I think, should give us pause, because I think we also have a responsibility. Those of us who are protecting the process, those of us who are telling the truth, we have a responsibility also to give people hope and faith in the system. Because if they lose that faith because other people are attacking it and then disengage, then the same effort to dismantle democracy has won, but in a different way. In other words, there's an effort to promote disengagement as a strategy, both a political strategy and a just overall kind of, strategy that we have to, I believe, also start taking more seriously. And so, from my standpoint, the other side of the coin as to why we are in a place where democracy did prevail in 2020 is because so many good people voted. So I shouldn't say that. So many good people did the right thing, from Brad Raffensperger to Barbara Sagafsky to election administrators at the state and local level all around the country. And also because so many people voted, because so many people were engaged, because so many people knew that by being engaged, that they could impact their future and the future of this country. If we lose that, then we really do lose. And so I think some of our work has to be both sort of taking on a two-front war, one, fighting back against the misinformation and telling the truth and all, and the policies and all that, but also giving people reasons to have faith and believe in democracy again. Because if we lose that, then our ability to prevail on any front is gone.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the true test of a healthy democracy is how free and fair the elections are, and the belief that people have in them. And in this moment, there have been a lot of calls for election officials to be that trusted source of information, and both of your offices have definitely been tested in this moment. So on top of all of your other duties, we've often laughed over the years that now an elections officer official needs to be an IT manager, and then a cybersecurity expert, and then a public health expert, and now also a messaging and public relations expert. So there's a wide swath of skills that are necessary to be able to get the information out to voters in a way that's meaningful. So I want to start with you, Registrar Kelley, with Neal. What in this moment has surprised you in the last year or in the recall, and what actions or what tactics did you find worked best in countering and quite frankly, we need to be correcting the false information that's out there?
Yeah, I hate to say this, Tammy, but I don't think there's a corner that I walk around anymore and nothing surprises me in this business, because when you think you've heard it all, you really have heard it all. And in the recall election that we just had in California, and I think Secretary Benson touched on this a little bit, this carryover from 2020, and I agree it's going to go into 2025, was really amplified here in California, even more so in the recall than in 2020. And I think that was kind of part of the playbook, was going to be, some of the people that were supporting the recall kind of took this same approach. And what worked best for us, and I want to focus on the recall election for me because I just got out of it. Social media was good, not great, but good. And, let's not deny the fact that some of the social media platforms have been incubators of misinformation. And that's something that I'm not afraid to say. And so when you're trying to fight misinformation on social media, sometimes it works, and other times it really is going on deaf ears. The second one I would say that I think we had much more traction with was reports, research, and third-party partnerships. And I've talked about this before, but our partnership with Caltech out here in Southern California has been fantastic because they've done voter registration audits on us. I've opened up the shop to them and said, these scientists from Caltech have come in and just scrubbed us. And that's been fantastic because we can now point to that information, and we can point to, solid research. I had somebody say, well, how can we trust Caltech? And I said, the individuals that put people on the moon, I don't know how we could trust Caltech. And so that becomes a bit frustrating. But I will tell you the third option that worked the best for us were one-on-one interactions. Now, you might be perplexed for me saying that. How do you have one-on-one interactions with 1.8 million registered voters? You chip away at a big tree with a butter knife. And just as a quick reference, a data point, we had about 25,000 phone calls that we handled from the time I mailed ballots out until the time of election day. And we were able to have individual conversations with voters that were calling in with these wild conspiracy theories. And it actually does a lot more good to have that kind of conversation with them. I really think that we should not conflate disagreements with laws and regulations and rules with this outrageous notion that all elections are rigged. And I think that's what a lot of voters are doing. They might be frustrated with election laws, but that does not equate to a rigged election. So at any rate, those are the top three for me.
Yeah, and I think that that's one thing that people forget is that there's always one side that's not happy after every election, and sometimes multiple sides if you have multiple candidates. So Secretary Benson, when Neal brought up the issue of platforms, and we of course now have our siloed news sources, and there was a question that came in around whether or not you see any real distinction between some of the cable news channels that have siloed audiences and the silos that users on the platforms put up themselves on who they see, who they interact with, and kind of what the distinction is between some of those things and what we can do to chip away at solving and breaking down some of those barriers, particularly if most of these channels have no interest in changing because it's how they generate revenue, it's how they can drum up the base of whatever that base happens to be.
Yeah, I think there needs to be a diversification of our sources of information, and we need to provide and find sources of information that go deeper than the cable news shows, and that allow for more nuance to be part of the conversation and multiple voices to be part of the conversation. And we've really gotten away from that, and just in terms of where people are getting their information. I think for a healthy democracy, you need both an informed electorate and an engaged electorate. And so a lot of the work that we do is make sure that folks are engaged. But when you look at our the decrease in funding on civics education over years, and I mean there's a long-standing disinvestment in ensuring we have informed voters as well, that has then enabled or created a vacuum through which cable news can enter, or other types of sort of more surface level, less nuanced conversations can fill the void. So I think that's really where, and I come at this, as you all know, and as Rick certainly knows, as an academic by training. So my parents were teachers. I'm an educator by training. So I think we have to think in a more broader way about, and a more thoughtful way about how to educate voters and how to ensure citizens are informed, because in the absence of that investment, wherever it could come from, we're seeing a flourishing of misinformation, and or I guess we're seeing the creation of environment that has really allowed misinformation to take hold and infect a lot of the body politic, because we would have some, a lot of the reliable structures, the thoughtful news programs, the in-depth analyses through investigative journalism and print journalism have fallen by the wayside and diminished so much that that the sources of information for our citizens is really has diminished significantly. And again, we see that even in the disinvestment of education and the attacks around trying to control the ability of professors and teachers to teach the truth in various settings. So I think it's all connected to making sure we have informed citizens. And I think those of us in the democracy space need to take on that piece as much as we focus on the mechanics and the infrastructure of democracy, enabling people to be engaged.
You're so right, because as this is metastasizing around the country, it is going to take more than just election officials to be speaking the truth about these things. And I would love to hear your thoughts on whether or not you feel it's entirely fair, because it seems like everyone is kind of turning to election officials as the trusted source. And you bring up both education and investigative journalism and some of the other actors in the field that can help with that. But is it fair to ask election officials to take on that weight, or should we be more expansive, as you mentioned, with civic education and some of these other elements?
I think we have to diversify the voices as well. I mean, look, election officials are the trusted sources of reliable information right now. We know there are also efforts afoot to, particularly in elected positions, replace professional elected officials with more partisan folks. And so I think that's something that we need to be mindful of moving forward. We were very fortunate in 2020 that election administrators did the right thing across the board. I don't know, given that it's been a strategy to replace some of those folks who did the right thing in the future, whether we'll be able to say that again with that certainty. So that said, not to take away from the professionalism of the folks who we know are professionals, that's a reality that is emerging. And because of that, we have to diversify the trusted voices, I believe, in our world. And election administrators can play a critical role in providing that trusted information to other messengers, to faith leaders, to business leaders, to sports leaders, to others that have platforms and voices, to other influential figures. The more people we have taking on that role as trusted voices for democracy, the more opportunities we have to cut through the rhetoric in multiple different fronts, which we're going to have to be prepared to do, particularly if we run, or if we're in the risk of, I mean, I guess to put it succinctly, I think in 2020, we didn't have any secretaries of state out there saying, at least publicly, advocating for the Stop the Steal movement, right? There was one who showed up to a rally and was widely condemned. I think in 2024, things may be different. I think through the primary challenges we're seeing in both, and others in other states, we should expect that there may be people who are elected as election administrators who perhaps don't serve as trusted sources of reliable information. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but that whether it does will be determined by who voters elect at the state and local level in 2022.
Yeah,
Neal,
can
I'd
I
love
just,
your thoughts.
yeah, I was just going to second what Secretary Benson said. I couldn't agree more. I had an opportunity a couple of years ago, was serving on the National Academy's voting committee, and we were hearing testimony from a senior Homeland Security official, and he used me as his example in his testimony. He said, it wouldn't be fair to tell Neal Kelley to go up against the Russian Federation on his own. And I think there's some certain truth to that, because obviously that was dealing with foreign influence, but we definitely need continued involvement from CISA and the good work that DHS has done on the federal level. The states certainly have a role. And like Secretary Benson said, in our communities, other individuals have a role. I think a great example is your neck of the woods, Tammy, your old neck of the woods, is Maricopa County Board of Supervisors and what they did, related to that audit. And so it's that collective energy that's really going to push this back.
And that's a great point to kind of use Arizona as an example, because what we saw was Secretary Hobbs did a tremendous job as a voice of trusted information. But after a while, for lots of different reasons, not the least of which was like her decision to run for governor, just sort of speaking frankly, but at the same time, the fact that there were other voices, other elected officials and others and even in the media, just kind of speaking the truth, really helped saturate the narrative and the messaging environment in a way that if it was just her and Adrian Fontes or and one of the other election administrators at the local level speaking it wouldn't have resonated in as much as it did. And I think the Maricopa County Supervisor's willingness to get out in front was really important.
I was very proud of my former jurisdiction, because on a daily basis, we just kept jumping the shark, right? Every day it was something new going on in Arizona. But I want to come back to that thought and that point around engaging the community. So later on this year in December, we're going to have the new language determinations that will be coming out from the census around the Voting Rights Act Section 203 determinations. So then, and those are the federal requirements of providing information to voters in one of four language categories or all four language categories, depending on what the numbers say. And I haven't heard a lot of discussion around the challenges of addressing mis and disinformation within those language communities. And Registrar Kelley, I know you have a fabulous outreach program. And so I'm curious what sort of things you've seen that have worked well, and what you would recommend to your colleagues across the country that maybe have never had a language requirement before and find themselves newly covered or have extended coverage in multiple languages in early December.
So we have 9 languages that we support here in Orange County plus English, 4 on the federal side and 5 on the state side. And I can tell you, Tammy, firsthand that we need to increase our presence in those communities as this disinformation, misinformation grows. That's absolutely vital that we reach out and have those one-on-one conversations like I was talking about with these communities. Putting information in government pamphlets and information that we send out is good, but that's not the answer. The answer has to be that we've got to connect with those communities in a different way. And it's not unheard of in the history of our country that immigrants and communities where English is a second language have been targets of misinformation. I mean, you can go back and look at that, back to Tammany Hall, back in New York, back a long time ago. So I think that that's certainly something that we need to be hyper aware of as we head into 22 and 24. We're planning on that as we gear up for that.
And Secretary Benson, how about in Michigan?
Yeah, it's such an important thing to talk about, because in Michigan, we have not been covered by 203. We may be under these new census numbers, but we've tried to, and one of our largest populations, Arabic speaking voters, which are still, and as I understand it, not covered under 203. And that was something that that I worked a lot on about 20 years ago. But that said, I think what we've done is, and work with local clerks to engage members of the community who may not meet the threshold, but are still sizable and in many cases benefit from accommodation and from translated election materials, and working with clerks to just be proactive at not just developing and bringing best practices and ensuring that materials are available in multiple languages. But also using technology to make all of our voting materials and everything that we do at the department accessible to multiple languages. So I think the most important thing is that we keep raising this as an issue. In the past, I think it's not been front and center in a lot of discussions like this and others. And so the most important thing is we keep talking about sharing best practices. I was just part of a discussion this morning with the Minnesota Secretary of State and the Colorado Secretary of State and the Maine Secretary of State, where we're all doing this work proactively and talking about it and sharing experiences. And so I think the more we do that, and the more others, academics and others, research and help provide us with ideas for best practices, the more we can be proactive and then therefore prepared if we do get covered and are required under federal law to do XYZ, that we're easily able to meet those requirements and then some.
Well, it's definitely something that's near and dear to my heart. And the determinations for the census says it'll be coming out probably the first week or so in December for everyone who wants to put that on their radar. And there will be a language access summit for voters in the middle of December that I will be hosting through Democracy Fund. So that's my shameless plug there. I knew this time was going to fly by. And we're almost at the end of our time with the secretary. So one of the things that I would love to cover, because I have about 12 more questions, but if we could talk just a little bit about forward looking next year. We've talked about this being a playbook now. I don't think this is going away anytime soon. So if you could speak to what are the things you really want voters particularly to understand and think about as we move into 2022, and then ultimately pass that into 2024?
I think the most important thing I would say is for people to remember is that the only thing that can stop a bad politician with a vote is a good citizen with a vote. And that the vote in that regard is the most powerful tool we have to fight back against everything we've talked about, all the misinformation, money in politics, corruption in politics, climate change, whatever issue is at the forefront of anyone's issues. It all starts with the most powerful tool we have, which is the vote. So use it and then join us in making sure others can use it as well, meaning serve as an election worker, find other ways to get involved. Democracy thrives when people pay attention, are engaged, and are participating in it. And so find everything that went into surviving and thriving for democracy in 2020, including the tens of thousands of people who served as election workers and poll workers for the first time. Don't lose that energy, bring it back, because we're going to need it even more to survive in 22 and 24. But I believe we can, because that's what history teaches us and the law is on our side. But it will only be able to succeed if people kind of join with us in staring down the misinformation, speaking the truth, spreading the truth, serving as a trusted source of information, and then stepping in and serving as an election worker, and in addition to being a voter in your community.
Engagement. I want to remind everyone, this is what some people call an off year. So the elections, which of course there are never any off years in elections, but these are local races in many places across the country. Some will be happening in the next month in November. And so to keep that in mind, that those are some of the really critical offices that affect the way you live. So Neal, how about you? What's on the agenda for 2022 into 2024 as we look forward?
So if I could break it up in two different ways. So the first I want to do is give you three things that I wish every voter would know. And this coming off the recall election is top of mind for me. Number one, every ballot is counted. And I know election officials repeat that mantra often, but I think it's important to get out there. The second is that there are more checks and balances, testing and auditing in elections that I think the average person has even a concept to understand, more than many financial institutions, in fact. And the third is that all election staff take an oath to uphold the Constitution and to do the right thing in their office. I had somebody ask me, observing the election for the recall, and said, how do you know that those individuals over there are not marking the ballot a different way again? And I said, sir, you're attacking the credibility of my staff and this office. And have you ever served on a jury? You take an oath when you serve on a jury, right? Or a police officer takes an oath, or a judge. All these individuals take oaths, and they're trusted individuals to uphold the Constitution. So that's the top three for that. Looking forward to 22 and 24, more in-person events like I talked to you about. We're expanding our community engagement staff because I think that's going to be very important in this climate. The second is we're creating misinformation toolkits. We'll be rolling those out for 22, and more to come on that. And then the third that I'm really proud of is getting ready to sign a partnership with a major technology vendor for an end-to-end solution to be able to match that with our current voting system and provide voters the opportunity to look and see and determine was their ballot tallied the way that they marked it. And I think from an optics perspective, going into 22 and 24, that's going to be really important.
That's outstanding. And I think really, really important that we have, sometimes election officials love our checklists. So having, the three things you really want, and I know we've got just a couple minutes left, but Secretary Benson, there've been some questions around, there's a lot happening this week with Facebook and some of the other platforms. And so one of the questions that I had was, what would be the one thing that you wish that the platforms would do, or that people who interact on social media would know about elections and the election systems?
I think official sources of information can be the most reliable, as we've talked about, and there are platforms like YouTube, for example, that proactively elevate official, reliable sources of information, and so there are some best practices out there, and for how social media can ensure that those using its platforms have access to reliable information in a meaningful way. And so I think we're going to start to see more as there's more transparency for how these entities act. We'll start perhaps seeing more that needs to be changed and improved. They've no doubt been at the center point of much of the spread of misinformation over the last year or so. And so I think more transparency is going to be key, and more people telling the truth, as the recent whistleblower has done, to shine a light on some of the practices that need to be changed so that we can have these outlets engaged as a more reliable source of information. And again, I think we need to start looking at some of the entities like YouTube, for example, who is a great partner in 2020 at identifying and stopping misinformation from flourishing, both proactively and reacting to reports of false misinformation. I think I'd like to see that same sort of leadership from some of the other media outlets, and I think we'll get it if more people call on them to do the same.
I think that's great. And Registrar Kelley, you have a very prominent footprint on social media, using it for good, of course, getting out good information. So what was as a frequent flyer, what would you want them to do differently to help you get that right information out to your voters and to the public?
I think one of the things they should consider, and there's been talk about this in the past, is identifying accounts in a different way. Using icons that might identify where those accounts are originated or where they're coming from, I think might be helpful. And I've had conversations with some of the social media platforms, and they've indicated some interest in that. I know that we had those discussions when we were talking about that at CISA and DHS. So I would certainly like to see that happen. And just like Secretary Benson said, more transparency, I think, is going to be just the way we need to go in 22 and 24.
Excellent. There's been a couple of comments in the chat as well. And one of the things that was brought up is that this is, a lot of good information that's being shared here and disseminating it to the local offices. Of course, in Michigan, you have a lot of local offices that you get information out to, which is very different from my former state in Arizona. There were 15 counties, which is dramatically different challenge. So I would love to hear, Jocelyn, as we go, or Secretary Benson, as we go into the next cycle, are there particular things that you would like your colleagues, the other secretaries of state, the state election boards, to be thinking about in terms of getting their local officials the right information, providing them with the right tools that they need to service those voters at the local level?
Well, yes, I think the partnership is key and communication is key. It's something that you can never have too much of. Working together, identifying resources for the local election administrators. In Michigan, we have just over 1,500 local clerks who administer elections. And then on top of that, 83 county clerks. So overall, about 1,600 or so election administrators that do the nuts and bolts of election administration on the local level, and working to build a partnership with them, as well as our federal government through the EAC in particular, so that we can increase the security of their operations, particularly their web portals, which we've worked to do by transferring to .gov portals, for example, and finding other ways that we can get them resources so that there's also equity in how elections are administered. One of the things we did was recruit over 30,000 election workers in 2020 in partnership with our clerks, and then the local clerks identify and place the election workers in a way that furthers what their needs are at the local level. But all across the board, communication, partnership, we're all in this together is key if we're going to move through it together. And then the other thing I'll say, because I recently just joined the network that is protecting local election administrators, is that, of course, the very tragic and unfortunate increase in threats to those managing and running elections has been a really unfortunate and terrible outgrowth of a lot of the toxicity we've seen in politics and in election administration over the past 2 years. And so making sure those local, that we have their back at the state level. I have access to more resources in terms of just protection than a local election administrator in a rural community of Michigan might have. So making sure that we're all working together to protect everyone as well, particularly at the local level, both from threats to election security and threats to their lives and livelihood, is a priority as well, and why that partnership in a moment like this is all the more important.
There are consequences to the mis and disinformation that's circulating and being purported and promoted all across the country. And that is, of course, the physical threats to local officials, and having colleagues across governmental levels and also within your own cohort. So Registrar Kelley, the state associations can be a big part of making sure that people have the right information, that you're sharing, what messaging is happening, and what you're saying to media markets that cross boundaries. That's another challenge in this moment, is that we have messages that might be true and accurate, but might be perceived as mis and disinformation because what's happening at the national level may not be the way it's done in Orange County, and all sorts of other things that come into play where you can have something that is true, it's just not true in your hometown. And so if you could just speak briefly about how you're leveraging the state association to take advantage of supporting your colleagues around the state of California. But you're also very, very active in some of the national groups. And I would say that is the mental lifeblood for election officials right now, is to know that they aren't the only ones in the trenches, and they're not the only ones that are receiving these threats based on the lies and mis and disinformation that's being conveyed.
Yeah, this is going to sound self-serving, but I think California, we've got one of the best associations out here among election officials, and everyone, of course, will say that in their own state. But it truly is remarkable the work that our association does collectively here in the state, and bringing information together and sharing that among all of us up and down the state is very helpful, especially during a statewide election. And to your point about the national side, I have had some of the best conversations in this business with my colleagues from other states, because you learn how things are done in other states, but you also, like you said, can gather information and be able to share it that's appropriate for your community, in a different way for the elections that you run locally. So I'm a big advocate of being involved at a national association as well as your state association. It's absolutely critical. And I just want to say one other thing related to the threats issue. I'm really encouraged by the work that's currently being done or talked about in Congress, as well as in our legislature here in California, related to protecting election officials. I think that work needs to continue, and it's serious business. When you combine, issues related to misinformation with people that might have other intents, that can cause problems, and so we don't want that to occur.
I think the days are long gone when election officials lament that they're toiling away in obscurity, because that's what we used to say 10 years ago. Like, we really wish people cared about what we did and we were being trying to be transparent. I think that transparency aspect is, the sunshine on what's happening, and sharing that and distributing it across all the platforms is going to be really critical to make sure that our voters understand that's what's happening. I want to share in the Q&A, Professor Miravaki at Mississippi State shared also that the Carter Center issued a really good report just yesterday or today on mis and disinformation in the social media. So we want to give a nod out to the Carter Center and the great folks there that are doing good work on this, and some of the other partners in this space, the academics, the nonprofits, the advocacy groups, the political parties that truly want to make sure that the truth is out there, to harken back to my X-File days. So we only have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to just leave enough time if there are any parting thoughts. Secretary Benson, before we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Registrar Kelley, and then we'll turn it back to Rick.
I think that now is the time for us to dig even deeper than we have in the past and really ensure and restore faith in our democracy. I believe completely that if we do that, we will be successful. But I think the alternative is to disengage, to lose hope, or to think that that we're in a battle that's unwinnable. And I think the entire history of our democracy comes down to whether in this moment we all stay engaged and work across party lines, as we have done at the election administrator level on both sides of the aisle, to simply just protect democracy and protect everyone's ability to hold their elected officials accountable. If we do that, we can be successful. We already were against really unprecedented efforts to undermine democracy in 2020. It survived because we pushed to make sure that it did, and voters across the country demanded it. And so we have to keep doing that over the next 4 or 5 years, and just be prepared for that long haul. And knowing that if we do that, if we actually put in the work, if we show up and do the work and stay engaged, we'll carry democracy through this and be stronger as a result.
Excellent. Registrar Kelley?
Thanks, Tammy. You know, this fixation with misinformation is not improving elections. In fact, it's doing the opposite. The irony of chasing these conspiracy theories is that it can deter voting across party lines, which I think is something that is not in the conversation enough. And even though election officials do not see evidence of widespread fraud, I think we should, as a group, continue to expand audits and improve the voter experience, because ultimately that's what's going to build confidence and continue to build confidence among our voters. And finally, I think we should put more effort into improving elections and relying less on encouraging litigants who think they can overturn election results based on rumor and conjecture. And that's my hope for 22 and 24, as optimistic as I can be.
Absolutely. I've been saying that, democracy is not something that one leaves up to others, that it has to be nurtured, exercised, and defended by every single one of us in order for it to survive. And in the last couple of years, I think it has really been demonstrated the actual fragility of our democracy that many of us, I think, took for granted, that it had an ability to withstand anything. And we now can see that there are things we need to do in order to shore up. And what that means is that we all need to stay engaged. We need to show resolve and believe in democracy and not fall into this pit of authoritarian rule or autocratic tyranny or any of those things. We need to double down on this great experiment and not falter in this moment. So I'm so thrilled to have been able to speak with you both this afternoon. It's great to see you. Hang in there, stay strong, be well, and I'll turn it back over to you, Rick.
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you to our panelists today, who were just making me slightly less terrified about 2024 and beyond. There were some very concrete suggestions, and there were also some larger, big picture things that I think we need to think about going forward. Let me just tell the audience about the next two events in the series. On October 27th at 12:15 p.m. Pacific, we'll have the second part of the series on disinformation in U.S. elections. And the speakers will be Danielle Citron of the University of Virginia Law School, Spencer Overton of the George Washington Law School Joint Center, and Nate Persley of Stanford Law School. I'll be moderating that event. And then on November 10th, which is also a Wednesday, again at 12:15 p.m. Pacific time, the third part of our series will be the view of social scientists on the question of disinformation in American elections. We've got Joan Donovan of Harvard, we've got Brendan Nyan of Dartmouth, and we've got Renee DiResta of Stanford. This will be moderated by Pam Fessler, NPR's former voting correspondent. And you can find links to these events, as well as all of the events of the Fair Elections and Free Speech Center at law.uci.edu/FEFS. Thanks again to Tammy Patrick for moderating this event. Thanks to all of you for attending, and we will see you again soon. Take care.